For 4 months, Nia brought breakfast to the old Korean man every single morning. Stir-fried eggs, a toasted bagel, hot tea in a thermos. 7 a.m. sharp on the cardboard sheet outside her apartment. She was 26, black, working grueling oncology graveyard shifts while drowning in nursing school debt. He was Grandpa, a quiet, frail man with a persistent wheeze who never told her a single story. Then this morning, the ritual shattered. A black sedan idled at the curb and a man stepped out. Navy three-piece suit, ink crawling up his neck, eyes like flint. He moved with a predatory stillness that stopped Nia's heart. "Nia Williams," he said, his voice a low, practiced vibration. He knew her name like he'd been tracking it for months. "You've been very kind to someone who belongs to us." He looked at the old man with agony. Abeoji. Nia realized then. Her simple act of mercy had just made her the only witness to a kingpin's return. Nia didn't walk away when the world told her to, but most people would. It's easy to ignore a stranger's struggle when it gets difficult, just like most people ignore the ghosts on their own street corners every single day. Before we reveal how deep this blood debt truly goes, tell us which corner of the world you are watching from today. If you actually value stories about the kind of courage most people lack, subscribe now. Don't be the person who looks away just when the stakes get real. The fluorescent hum of the oncology ward always stayed in Nia's ears, long after she punched out at 6:30 a.m. It was a heavy, sterile sound, the soundtrack of a world where life was measured in milligram dosages and the steady beep of monitors. By the time she stepped onto the cracked pavement of 5th Street, her compression socks felt like lead and her mind was a cluttered mess of patient charts and the predatory red font of her latest student loan statement. She was 26, and most days she felt like she was running a race on a treadmill that someone had set to an impossible incline. The city didn't care about her exhaustion. It roared around her in a blur of grey exhaust and early morning commuters who looked through people rather than at them. But Nia couldn't do that. It was the nurse in her, the part of her that couldn't ignore a wheeze or a tremor, that had stopped her in her tracks 4 months ago when she first saw the old man. He was a fixture now, tucked into the alcove of a shuttered deli, sitting on a flattened refrigerator box, with a dignity that seemed to defy his surroundings. To the rest of the neighborhood, he was a ghost in a tattered coat. To Nia, he was Mr. Park, a man whose lung sounds she monitored more closely than some of her actual patients. "Gamsahabnida," Mr. Park murmured today as she knelt beside him, his voice like dry parchment. He reached out with hands that were thin but steady to take the warm container of stir-fried eggs and the toasted bagel she'd prepared before her shift. "You're welcome, Grandpa," Nia said, offering a tired smile. "And don't think I didn't notice you skipping your vitamins yesterday. I saw the bottle was still full." The old man chuckled, a soft sound that usually ended in a rasping cough. He pointed toward the steaming tea she'd brought. "You, Angel," he said in his broken English, a title he had bestowed upon her during their 2nd month. "Angel of 5th Street." Nia shook her head, adjusting the wool scarf around his neck. "I'm just a woman who doesn't want to see you back in an ER, Mr. Park. Now tell me the word for breathe. You promised." "Some," he said, tapping his chest. "Sum shwida." "Sum shwida," Nia repeated, the unfamiliar syllables feeling strange on her tongue. For 30 minutes every morning, the world narrowed down to this small patch of concrete. The crushing weight of her $80,000 debt and the memory of the patient she'd lost at 3 a.m. faded into the background. Here she wasn't an overworked nurse aide or a girl struggling to keep her head above water. She was a protector. She watched him eat, making sure he took the blood pressure medication she'd helped him obtain through a local clinic, and in return, he gave her a sense of peace that the hospital could never provide. He never spoke of where he came from, or why a man with his refined posture was sleeping on cardboard, and Nia never asked. In the ward, everyone had a history written in a file. Here, the only thing that mattered was the dignity of the present moment. She was mid-sentence, correcting her pronunciation of a Korean greeting, when the morning air suddenly lost its warmth. The usual ambient noise of the city, the distant sirens and honking horns, seemed to fall away, replaced by a heavy, pressurized silence. Nia felt the hair on, her arms stand up before she heard the car. It wasn't the rattling engine of a city bus or the screech of a taxi. It was the low, expensive purr of a precision-tuned machine. She looked up, her hand still resting on Mr. Park's shoulder, and saw the black sedan gliding to a halt like a shark in shallow water. The man who stepped out didn't belong on 5th Street. His navy suit caught the morning light, perfectly tailored to a frame that radiated a violent, controlled energy. As he walked toward them, Nia felt the neighborhood quiet transform into a predatory stillness. She moved instinctively, shifting her body to partially shield Mr. Park, her nursing instinct screaming that the peace of their ritual was over. She didn't know then that the man she called Grandpa was a fallen king, or that the man approaching them was his heir, but as the stranger's eyes locked onto the frail elder, the air between them grew thick with a year's worth of blood and secrets. The heavy thud of the car door closing felt like a gavel striking a desk, finalizing a sentence Dae-hyun wasn't sure he was ready to serve. For 365 days, he had lived in a state of suspended mourning, operating on the cold assumption that his father's ashes were scattered across the floor of a burned-out safe house in Seoul. The coup had been surgical, a betrayal from within the inner circle that had allowed the white tigers to tear through their territory like starving predators. Since that night, Dae-hyun had been a ghost, leading an army of shadows, his every move scrutinized by lieutenants who smelled weakness in his grief. Now standing on a grime-streaked sidewalk in a city that felt 1,000 miles from the throne he was struggling to hold, the world tilted on its axis. The man sitting on the cardboard wasn't the great Park who had once commanded thousands with a flick of his wrist. This man was shrunken, his skin the color of old parchment, his regal posture maintained only by a fragile, stubborn will. Seeing him like this, fed by a woman in rumpled scrubs, sent a spike of pure, unadulterated agony through Dae-hyun's chest. It was a humiliation more profound than any bullet wound. Abeoji. The word felt like it was being pulled from his throat with a hook. Dae-hyun felt the woman's gaze before he looked at her. She didn't flinch. Most people, when they saw the ink crawling up the sides of his neck and disappearing beneath his jawline, looked away. The tattoos were a map of his hierarchy, a permanent record of the dragon bloodline that demanded fear. The scales etched into his skin represented the armor he was forced to wear, the heavy price of a life where mercy was a foreign dialect. But this woman, Nia, the name his scouts had whispered to him, stood her ground. She moved with the protective grace of a lioness, shifting her weight to place herself between him and the frail man she called Grandpa. He could feel the eyes of his men behind the tinted glass of the sedan, waiting for a signal. They were under siege. The white tigers had moved into their shipping lanes 2 nights ago, and the syndicate was bleeding cash and loyalty. Dae-hyun was a man drowning in a war of succession, and he had come here expecting to find a strategic asset or a body to bury. He hadn't expected to find a nurse with kind eyes in a bagel container. The silence on the street grew heavy, pressurized by the contrast between his world and hers. He looked at the silk of his three-piece suit, a uniform of power that felt like a shroud, and then at the cardboard. His father had chosen this. The legendary founder of their empire had walked away from the silk and the blood, choosing the cold concrete over the son he had raised to be a monster. Dae-hyun's hands trembled, a rare lapse in his iron control. He looked at Nia, really seeing her for the first time. She was the angel his father had found in the wreckage of his old life. She represented everything Dae-hyun had been taught to exploit or ignore: selflessness, radical kindness, and the quiet courage of someone who had nothing to gain. "Step back," he commanded, though the ice in his voice was cracked with desperation. He wasn't speaking to the old man. He was speaking to the nurse who was holding the only piece of his heart he had left. "You don't understand what you're standing in the middle of, Nia Williams. This isn't a neighborhood dispute. This is a debt that can never be paid in breakfast." The heavy silence of the street was broken not by the roar of the idling sedan, but by the soft, rattling breath of the man on the cardboard. Mr. Park looked up, his eyes moving from the polished shoes of the son he had sired to the worn sneakers of the woman who had saved him. The grandpa mask didn't slip so much as it dissolved, revealing a sharp, ancient intelligence that Nia hadn't fully glimpsed until now. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed Nia's arm, a silent request for her to stay. "Dae-hyun," the old man said, his voice no longer a broken rasp but a low, commanding resonance that seemed to vibrating through the concrete. "You look for a ghost, but the ghost does not want to be found." Dae-hyun's jaw tightened, the ink on his neck shifting as his muscles coiled. "The syndicate is falling, Abeoji. The white tigers are at the gates. They think you are dead, and they are carving up the empire you built with your own blood. You sleep on trash while I fight a war to keep your name alive." Mr. Park stood, leaning heavily on Nia's shoulder. She felt the surprising weight of him, not just the physical weight of a frail man, but the metaphorical weight of a history she was only beginning to grasp. He looked at his son, his eyes tracing the intricate, violent art etched into Dae-hyun's skin. "I did not lose my way, Nia," the old man said, turning his gaze to her. For the first time he spoke to her in fluent, though weary, English. "I did not forget who I was. I chose to forget. I walked away from the silk because the silk was soaked in too much red. I looked at my son, the boy I taught to be strong, and I saw a man who had forgotten the sound of a heartbeat. I saw a monster I had created." Nia felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the morning air. She looked at the man she had been feeding stir-fried eggs to for months. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was a defector from a life of absolute power. He had traded a palace for a refrigerator box because the box was the only place he could find peace. He had chosen the cold of the street over the warmth of blood-stained luxury. "I saw you every morning, Nia," Mr. Park continued, his voice softening. "You healed me not because I was a king, but because I was a man who was coughing. In your world, a life has value because it exists. In his world, a life has value only if it can be used. I stayed here because I wanted to be seen, just once, as a human being before I died." Dae-hyun stepped forward, his eyes flashing with a mixture of reverence and fury. "You are the dragon, Abeoji. You don't have the luxury of being human. If the tigers find you here, they won't just kill you. They will burn this entire block to erase the shame of your survival." The realization hit Nia like a physical blow. She wasn't just a nurse helping a neighbor. She was harboring a high-value target in a global power struggle. By giving Mr. Park a bagel and a warm scarf, She had inadvertently stepped into the crosshairs of a war she couldn't possibly win. She looked at the sedan, at the men in the shadows, and then back at the grandpa, who had taught her how to say breathe in a language of secrets. She was no longer just a witness to a return. She was the guardian of a man who had committed the ultimate sin in the world of the Mafia. He had chosen mercy over the throne. The transition from the sidewalk to the four walls of her third-floor studio felt less like a rescue and more like a retreat into a gilded cage. Nia had spent the last 3 hours moving in a state of high-functioning shock, her nurse's brain taking over while her heart tried to process the reality that the man now sitting on her thrift store sofa was a fugitive kingpin. Dae-hyun had vanished back into his sedan with a final, haunting look, leaving 2 of his men, silent, stony-faced sentinels, stationed in the alleyway below. The apartment was small, smelling of lavender detergent and the lingering scent of the morning's bagels, but the atmosphere was brittle. Mr. Park sat upright, his hands folded over the knees of his worn trousers. He looked smaller here, surrounded by her nursing, textbooks and the mundane clutter of a life defined by student debt. "You should sleep, Mr. Park," Nia whispered, her hands trembling as she organized her trauma bag on the kitchen counter. It was a habit of hers, keeping a fully stocked kit for neighborhood emergencies. "Your blood pressure is through the roof." "The tiger does not sleep when it hears the brush move," he replied, his eyes fixed on the door. The knock came at 9:15 p.m. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic thud of Dae-hyun's men. It was a light, impatient rapping. "Delivery for Williams," a muffled voice called out. "I've got a package that needs a signature." Nia froze. She hadn't ordered anything. She moved to the door, her hand hovering over the deadbolt, her clinical eye catching a shadow through the peephole. The man outside wore a generic courier's windbreaker, but his posture was wrong. He wasn't shifting his weight like someone bored by a long shift. He was braced. His eyes didn't look at the door handle. They scanned the frame for weaknesses. "I didn't order anything," Nia said, her voice steadying as the adrenaline kicked in. "Leave it in the lobby." "It's registered, miss. I need a signature or I lose my bonus." The door didn't just open. It exploded inward. The frame splintered as the driver threw his weight against it, the chain snapping like a twig. Nia was thrown backward, her shoulder hitting the kitchen island, but as the man stepped into the light, she didn't see a courier. She saw a predator. He reached into his jacket, the metallic glint of a suppressed pistol catching the overhead light. Nia didn't think. She reacted with the muscle memory of 100 emergency room codes. She didn't have a gun, but she had the tools of her trade. Her hand closed around a heavy, pressurized canister of medical-grade disinfectant from her open kit. As the man leveled the weapon toward the sofa where Mr. Park sat, Nia lunged. She didn't aim for his chest. She aimed for the vulnerable anatomy she'd studied for years. She slammed the heavy canister into the side of his knee, the joint buckling with a sickening pop. As he hissed in pain, his aim wavering, Nia swung her trauma shears, thick, industrial-grade steel designed to cut through leather and bone, with a jagged, desperate strength. She didn't stab. She used the blunt end of the heavy shears to strike the nerve cluster at the base of his neck, a move she'd once seen a security guard use on a violent patient. The man collapsed, the pistol skittering across the linoleum. Nia scrambled over him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She grabbed the man's arm, intending to pin him, but, as his sleeve rode up, she froze. Etched into the pale skin of his forearm was a snarling white tiger. The mark was fresh, the ink still vibrant against the red of his rising bruises. It was a declaration of war delivered to her doorstep. The white tigers weren't waiting for Dae-hyun to find his father. They were already hunting. Nia looked up at Mr. Park, who hadn't moved. His expression wasn't one of fear, but of profound, weary sadness. Nia looked at her hands, stained with the dust of the splintered door, and the sweat of a struggle she never should have been part of. She realized then that the hospital walls could no longer protect her. She wasn't just a nurse anymore, she was a combatant in a shadow war, and the angel of Fifth Street had just drawn her first line in the sand. Nia is currently bleeding and terrified for a man who isn't even her kin, proving that true humanity comes at a price most are far too selfish to pay. She is risking her entire future while you watch from the total safety of your screen. If you believe her sacrifice deserves to be witnessed until the very end, hit that subscribe button right now. Leaving her story behind now, after she's given up everything to protect a forgotten soul, would be the ultimate betrayal of the kindness she stands for. The splintered door of her apartment was a jagged reminder that the world had narrowed to a single, desperate goal: survival. Nia didn't wait for the police or the white tigers to send a second wave. With the adrenaline still masking the ache in her shoulder, she guided Mr. Park down the fire escape, his breathing now a wet, frantic rattle that signaled the transition from a persistent wheeze to full-blown pneumonia. The black sedan was gone, but as they reached the alley, a silver SUV glided out of the darkness. The windows rolled down just enough to reveal the cold, alert eyes of Dae-Hyun's lieutenants. They didn't speak. They simply motioned them inside. St. Jude's Memorial looked like a fortress of glass and steel under the harsh city lights. But to Nia, it was a labyrinth she knew by heart. She directed the driver to the loading docks near the oncology wing, far from the prying eyes of the main ER admitting desk. "Stay in the stairwell," Nia whispered to the two men in charcoal suits as they helped Mr. Park onto a stolen wheelchair. "If security sees you, this ends. If you see anyone who doesn't belong, you call me." The men nodded, their hands resting near the waistbands of their slacks, their presence creating a jarring friction against the sterilized, pastel-colored walls. This was Nia's world, a place of healing, but tonight it felt occupied by a silent, lethal army. She navigated the back corridors with practiced ease, dodging the floor scrubbers and the tired orderlies. She checked him in under the name Samuel Kim, a distant relative with no insurance and a sudden onset of respiratory distress. It was a lie that could cost her her license, but as she watched Mr. Park's pulse oximeter flicker at a dangerous 88%, the weight of her professional oath felt heavier than the threat of unemployment. "Nia, why are you on the floor? You're not scheduled until tomorrow night." The voice was like a cold splash of water. Nia turned to see Mrs. Gable, the night shift supervisor, standing by the nurse's station with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Gable was a woman who smelled of peppermint and discipline, a 30-year veteran who could spot a chart error from across a crowded room. Her eyes drifted from Nia's disheveled hair to the frail man in the wheelchair. "He's a family friend, Mrs. Gable," Nia said, her voice hitching despite her best efforts. "I found him like this when I got home. The ER was backed up 6 hours, and I knew bed 4 in the subacute wing was empty. I couldn't let him sit in a waiting room." Gable stepped closer, her gaze narrowing as she took in Mr. Park's cyanotic lips. "He needs a full workup, Nia, and an official intake. You know the protocol for charity cases. If administration catches wind, I'll handle the paperwork," Nia interrupted, her heart hammering. "I just need to get him on a nebulizer and start a round of levofloxacin, please. I've seen him every day for months. He won't make it until morning without intervention." Mrs. Gable looked at the old man, then back at Nia. For a long, agonizing second, the silence of the ward was absolute. Then Gable gave a single, stiff nod. "Bed 4. I didn't see you come in, and I certainly didn't see you bypass triage. But if he codes Nia, it's your name on the line." As Nia wheeled Mr. Park toward the darkened room, she caught a glimpse of a movement in the reflection of the glass partitions. A man in a lab coat was standing at the end of the hall, but he wasn't checking a chart. He was looking at his watch, his shoulders too broad for the garment, his posture echoing the predatory stillness of the man in her apartment. Dae-hyun's men were here, woven into the shadows of the hospital, turning the halls of healing into a potential kill zone. She began the IV start, her hands steady only because she refused to look at the door. The suit and scrubs atmosphere was a suffocating pressure. She was trapped between the rigid rules of her profession and the violent reality of the dragon's debt. As the antibiotics began to drip into Mr. Park's vein, Nia realized the hospital wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the lock was about to be turned from the outside. The steady, rhythmic hiss of the nebulizer was the only sound in room 412. A fragile, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to hold the encroaching darkness at bay. Nia sat in the plastic guest chair, her eyes burning from 48 hours of near total wakefulness. She was watching the monitor, 92% oxygen saturation, when the air in the room shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a change in pressure, the familiar weight of a predator entering a quiet space. Dae-hyun stepped out of the shadows by the window. He had shed the navy suit jacket, his white dress shirt rolled up to reveal the black scales of the dragon tattoos coiling around his forearms. He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face drawn tight by the strain of a war being fought on two fronts. Without a word, he set a heavy, leather-bound briefcase on the foot of Mr. Park's bed. The latches clicked open with a sound like a bone breaking. Inside, stacked in neat, suffocating rows, were hundreds of crisp, high-denomination bills. It was more money than Nia would earn in a decade of double shifts. It was the answer to every predatory red letter from the loan collectors. It was her tuition, her future, and a way out of the neighborhood that was slowly trying to kill her. "This is the end of the ritual, Nia," Dae-hyun said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "There is enough here to pay your debts and move you to a city where nobody knows your name. My father is stable now. My men will handle the transition to a private facility at dawn. You have done more than mercy required. Now, walk away." Nia looked at the money, then at the man whose life she had been shielding. Mr. Park's face was peaceful under the plastic mask, his chest rising and falling with a strength that hadn't been there 12 hours ago. She felt the weight of the briefcase, the sheer gravity of what it represented, but when she looked back at Dae-hyun, her eyes were clear. "You think this is a transaction," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You see a debt that needs to be settled so you can feel balanced again. But I didn't stay up all night because I wanted a payout, Dae-hyun. I stayed up because he's my patient. And until I discharge him, he isn't a ghost or a king. He's a man who needs a nurse." She reached out and closed the lid of the briefcase, the snap echoing in the small room. "He isn't for sale, and neither am I. If you want to move him, you do it because it's medically safe, not because you've bought my silence." Dae-hyun stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the ruthless head of the syndicate was silent, the silence of a man encountering a law he didn't know how to break. A flicker of something that looked dangerously like respect crossed his features, a softening of the flint in his eyes. He realized then that Nia Williams wasn't a liability because she was weak. She was a liability because she was the only person in his life who couldn't be controlled. "You are a fool," he whispered, though there was no venom in it. "In my world, people like you are the first to burn." "Then it's a good thing we're in my world tonight," Nia replied. But as Dae-hyun turned to signal his men, The red dot of a laser sight danced briefly across the back of Nia's scrub top. A silent, lethal firefly reflected in the window glass. Outside, in the rain-slicked parking lot, a man in a white windbreaker lowered his binoculars and spoke into a radio. The white tigers didn't need to find the great park anymore. They had found the only person the dragon was willing to protect, and in the cold logic of the syndicate, that made Nia the most valuable target in the city. The silence that followed the power failure was more violent than any explosion. One moment, the ward was a symphony of electronic chirps and the steady hum of the ventilation system. The next, the world was plunged into a thick, suffocating velvet. The emergency red lights flickered once, twice, and then died, sabotaged. In the sudden vacuum of sound, Nia heard the heavy click of a safety being disengaged and the sharp, indrawn breath of the man standing by the window. "Stay on the floor. Do not move from his side," Daehyun commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He didn't wait for her to answer. He vanished into the hallway just as the first muffled thud, thud, thud of suppressed gunfire echoed through the linoleum corridors. Nia didn't stay on the floor. She couldn't. In the darkness, the rhythmic hiss of Mr. Park's nebulizer had stopped, replaced by a sound that made her blood run cold. The wet, desperate struggle for air. She fumbled for the penlight in her scrub pocket, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom to reveal Mr. Park's face. It was turning a terrifying shade of dusky purple. His chest was heaving, but only on the left side. The right was unnervingly still. "Grandpa, look at me. Stay with me," she whispered, her fingers flying to his neck. His trachea was shifting to the left, a tension pneumothorax. The pressure in his chest was building so fast, it was crushing his heart. If she didn't act in the next 60 seconds, the great park would die in the dark, not from a rival's bullet, but from a collapsed lung. Outside the door, the hospital had become a slaughterhouse. She heard the heavy crash of a body, hitting a medication cart, the snarl of Korean curses, and the unmistakable sound of Dae-hyun's predatory stillness shattering into a whirlwind of violence. A man screamed, the sound cut short by a wet choke, but Nia forced her mind to narrow down to the 3 inches of space between Mr. Park's ribs. She reached for her trauma kit, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped the large-bore decompression needle. Second intercostal space. Mid-clavicular line, she recited to herself, a mantra of survival. A heavy blow struck her door, the wood groaning. Someone was trying to kick it in. "Nia, hold the door!" Dae-hyun shouted from the hallway, his voice strained, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Nia ignored the door. She ignored the shadow of a man appearing in the frosted glass of the patient room, his silhouette raised like a reaper. She climbed onto the bed, straddling Mr. Park's chest to get the leverage she needed. She held the penlight between her teeth, the beam dancing over his pale skin. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," she sobbed, though her hands were suddenly, miraculously steady. She drove the needle home. The hiss of escaping air was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of life returning. Mr. Park's chest shuddered, his lungs expanding as the lethal pressure vanished. At that exact moment, the door burst open. Nia didn't look up. She was focused on the needle, on the life-saving flow of oxygen, even as a figure loomed over her. She expected the cold bite of a bullet. Instead, she felt the warmth of a hand on her shoulder. Dae-hyun stood there, his white shirt now a roadmap of crimson splatters, his breathing ragged. He looked at Nia, still perched over his father with a needle in her hand and a flashlight in her teeth, and then at the old man who was finally, deeply breathing. The professional oath Nia carried wasn't a weakness. It was a shield that had held firm while his world of violence had almost let his father slip away. "The floor is clear," Dae-hyun rasped, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a brand. "But the city is waking up. We have to move. Now." Nia pulled the needle, her eyes meeting Mr. Park's as he drifted back into a stable sleep. She realized then that she could never go back to being just a nurse in a ward. She had performed a miracle in a war zone, and the bond she felt for the old man on the bed was no longer just professional. He was family, and she was the only thing standing between him and the grave. The adrenaline that had fueled Nia's hands during the needle decompression began to ebb, replaced by a cold, hollow tremor. She watched as Mr. Park's eyes fluttered open, the hazy confusion of the pneumonia replaced by a terrifying crystalline clarity. He looked at the crimson-stained shirt of his son, and then at the trauma shears still gripped in Nia's white-knuckled hand. He didn't look like a grandpa anymore. He looked like an architect of empires surveying a ruin. "Help me up," Mr. Park commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an edict. "Mr. Park, you just had a lung collapse," Nia protested, her voice cracking. "You're in no condition to—" "Help me up, Nia," he repeated, his gaze softening only for a fraction of a second as it met hers. "Or the blood in these hallways will never dry." With Nia on one side and a stunned Dae-hyun on the other, the man who had slept on cardboard for a year stood. He moved with a brutal, agonizing grace, leaning into them until they reached the heavy double doors of the ward. Outside, in the flickering emergency lights of the main corridor, a standoff had frozen the world in place. 3 men in white windbreakers, white tigers, held their weapons leveled at Dae-hyun's remaining guards. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and copper. "Drop them," Mr. Park's voice rang out. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a mountain. The white tiger gunmen recoiled as if they had seen a ghost. To them, the Great Park was a myth, a dead man whose ghost was used to justify their coup. Seeing him standing, flanked by a nurse and his blood-splattered heir, turned their certainty into ash. "I am the man who built the docks you thrive on," Mr. Park said, stepping away from Nia's support to stand unaided, though his face was the color of ash. "I am the one who signed the treaties that kept your fathers alive. You hunt a throne that I burned a year ago. Look at me." He gestured to his hospital gown, to the IV bruise on his arm, and finally to Nia. "This woman saved my life twice, not because I am a king, but because she is human. You, who call yourselves warriors, have brought your filth into a house of healing." The lead tiger, a man with a jagged scar across his brow, lowered his weapon an inch. "The syndicate says you are dead, Elder. If you live, the war continues." "Then let the syndicate be right," Mr. Park countered. He turned to Dae-hyun, his eyes boring into his son's soul. "Dae-hyun, you want the mantle? Take it. But the price of my return to the shadows is a peace that lasts. You will cede the northern lanes. You will end the hunt. I will remain a ghost, buried in the records of this hospital, and you will lead not as a monster, but as a man who owes a debt to mercy." Dae-hyun's jaw worked, his eyes shimmering with a conflict Nia couldn't fully grasp. The desire for total victory clashing with the absolute command of the father he had mourned. He looked at Nia, then at the frail man who had chosen a sidewalk over a crown. "The tigers withdraw," Dae-hyun said, his voice a low growl directed at the rival gunman. "The Great Park is dead. He died in the coup. What stands here is a man I do not know. Go tell your masters the war is over, or I will burn every harbor you own." The white tigers retreated into the shadows of the stairwell, their presence evaporating like a fever dream. As the last of them vanished, the strength left Mr. Park's legs. He collapsed back into the wheelchair Nia had shoved beneath him, his breathing once again a shallow, ragged struggle. The command was over. The king had spoken, and in doing so he had abdicated for the final time. Nia knelt beside him, checking his pulse, her heart finally slowing. The violence had stopped, but as she looked at Dae-hyun, she saw the shift in him, a heavy, somber recognition. The angel of Fifth Street had saved the father, but she had also changed the son. The city still roared with the same indifferent hunger, but on Fifth Street the rhythm had fundamentally shifted. 6 months had passed since the night the lights went out at St. Jude's, and for Nia, the world was no longer a race on a treadmill set to an impossible incline. She stood in the center of a small, sun-drenched room, the scent of fresh paint and antiseptic, a familiar comfort. On the wall hung a simple frame containing a document she had once thought she'd be chasing for another 3 years. Nia Williams, registered nurse. The anonymous scholarship that had cleared her $80,000 debt had arrived in a plain white envelope just weeks after the hospital lockdown. There had been no letter, no return address, only a single business card embossed with a small, subtle dragon scale. It was a silent acknowledgement of a debt that couldn't be paid in cash, yet was being settled in the only currency that mattered to her: opportunity. Nia stepped out of the front door of the clinic, the bell chiming softly behind her. She didn't walk past the shuttered deli anymore. Instead, she stood on the very spot where the refrigerator box had once sat. The cracked pavement was gone, replaced by a raised stone planter filled with medicinal herbs and resilient, vibrant perennials. Mr. Park was there, kneeling in the rich soil. He wore a clean linen shirt and sturdy trousers, his frame filled out by 6 months of regular meals and the absence of a life-threatening wheeze. He was tending to a patch of Korean mint, his hands moving with a slow, meditative grace. He wasn't the great Park of the underworld or the grandpa of the sidewalk. He was simply a man who had finally found a home. "The soil is good today, Nia," he said, looking up with a smile that reached his eyes. He still taught her a word of Korean every morning, but now they were words for growth, peace, and neighbor. "It's 7, Mr. Park," Nia said, sitting on the edge of the planter. She didn't bring a paper cup or a plastic container today. She brought 2 ceramic mugs of hot tea, the steam curling into the crisp morning air. As they sat together, Nia's gaze drifted to the corner. A black sedan with deep-tinted windows sat idling half a block away. It was there every morning, a silent obsidian shadow that never moved and never interfered. She knew Dae-hyun was likely behind that glass, or at least his hand-picked sentries. The white tigers had vanished from the neighborhood, replaced by a quiet, invisible shield that ensured the clinic's windows were never broken and the street stayed safe. The dragon was keeping his word. The war of succession had ended in a stalemate of shadows, allowing the father to remain a ghost so the son could lead with a new kind of authority, one tempered by the memory of a nurse who wouldn't be bought. Nia took a sip of her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. She looked at the community clinic, a building funded by private investors who preferred to stay in the dark, and then at the old man who was currently arguing with a stubborn weed. The cardboard was long gone, but its legacy was written into every brick of the sanctuary they had built. She had set out to be a nurse to heal bodies, but on this street corner she had learned that the strongest medicine wasn't found in a pharmacy. It was found in the radical, dangerous choice to look at a stranger and see a human being. The angel of Fifth Street took a deep breath of the morning air, No longer a witness to a crime, but a guardian of a peace that had been bought with a bagel and a bit of mercy. The cardboard is gone, but the lesson Nia taught the dragon remains. Mercy is the only thing that outlives a throne. This journey has reached its final conclusion, and if you've made it this far without subscribing, you might have missed the heart of this message entirely. Don't let this be the last time we explore the dignity of the unseen together. Subscribe now to ensure the legacy of the Fifth Street Clinic continues, or walk away and forget the angel, just like the rest of the indifferent city.